Welcome to the 9th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of the flows published to your Tableau server. I'll show you how to query your Tableau server for information on each flow using Tableau Server Client, and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A flows report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of flows. It allows you to answer questions like, how many total flows does our Tableau server currently contain? How many flows are owned by each user? Which user owns each flow? What are the details of each flow? When was each flow created and last updated? When was the flow last executed? What is the average, maximum, minimum, and range of runtime durations for each flow? Capturing runtime duration statistics for each flow is critical to performance monitoring. Long durations may be indicative of poor design or upstream issues and warrant review by the appropriate developer or data engineer. Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on the flows published to my Tableau server. For this example, I am going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all flows existing on the server. After retrieving that list of flow objects, I will start by creating a simple report that provides important details on each flow. I will then further develop the structure and contents of this report by incorporating what you learned in my video on generating a user report to include each flow owner's details within the report. At the end of this walkthrough, I'll show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired flows report. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object configured in the first code block to sign in. I have went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. I'll begin by running this initial block to configure the Tableau Server Client object. Okay, I've successfully created the Tableau Server Client object. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that object to sign in to my server and gather a list of all flow objects. To do that, I'm going to say flows equals flow for flow and tsc.pager server.flows. So I'm accessing the flows endpoint to gather a list of flows maintained on my server, and I'm putting those in a list. So let's go ahead and do that and run that. Let's look at flows. So this is a list of flow objects maintained on my server. So we have 2 flows here. And what we can do just to verify this, because I know that formatting is a little messed up. Let's look at it. So 2 flows on my server. Let's go ahead and look at the attributes that are maintained for each flow. So I'm just going to access the first flow in that list and look at the dictionary representation of that. So we have quite a few attributes. For my reports, I'm going to go ahead and extract the ID, the owner ID, the name of the flow, the project ID, project name, and the content URL. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a data frame. So I'm going to say flow info is equal to pd.dataframe. And then I'm going to provide a series of key value pairs. So the keys are going to be the name of the column, and the values are going to be each flow's attributes corresponding to that column name. So let's go ahead and do flow ID. And then I'm going to use list comprehension again to extract each ID from each object in the flows list. So let's go flow.id for flow in flows. And then we're going to do more or less a copy and paste exercise here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste a few of these, one per attribute that I need. I'm going to say flow owner ID, so who owns the flow. And again, I'm not memorizing these, right? These aren't coming off the top of my head. These are actually down here listed as the attributes maintained for each flow object. All right, so let's go ahead and this actually needs to be a dictionary, as I said. So let's go ahead and wrap this in curly braces. Do a little bit more indenting and then continue. So I'm extracting the owner ID for each flow in the list of flow objects. The next thing I want to do is I want to get the flow name. So what is the name of the flow? Let's do the project ID. So where does the flow sit on my server? And the project name. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and let's look at the flow info data frame. All right, so we have one row per flow and this corresponding ID, owner ID, name, project ID, and project name. So again, what we did is we used the flows endpoint to generate or create a list of flow objects maintained on my server. And then we created the bit data frame that uses list comprehension to extract a particular value or attribute for each flow in the flows list. So in this case, we extracted the ID for each flow in the flows list, the owner ID, etc. All right, so we have our flow info data frame, and I'm just going to say create a data frame containing flow information. All right, so we have the flow info corresponding to each flow maintained on my server. The next thing I want to do is I want to get the run history for each of these flows. And in that, I want to compute the number of times this flow is ran, the total duration across all runs, the average duration, maximum duration, minimum duration, and the difference between those last two attributes, so the duration range. To do that, I'm going to use the flow runs endpoint. So I'm going to say gather all, let's just say gather flow run history. And what we'll do is we'll say runs is equal to run for run in tsc.pager server.flowruns. So this endpoint can be used to tie each of the runs to a flow. So more or less the execution history of a particular flow. So I need to actually say, this is correct. Yeah, run for run in TSC pager server.flowruns. That should be fun. Oh, I see. I just said fun. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. And then let's look at the runs list. All right, so we have quite a few runs. Each of these represents a particular execution of a particular flow. So let's look at the first one. So I'm just going to access the first run object in the runs list and look at the dictionary representation of that. Okay, so for each run, each flow run, the ID, the flow associated with the run is captured, the status, so was it successful or did it fail? When was the run started? When did it completed? Or when did it complete? The progress and the background job ID associated with the run. So progress will be 0 if it's in progress, 100 if it is completed. Okay, so the important attributes I want to grab out of here, if I just need to compute some statistics based on all of the runs for each flow, I really just need the flow ID and I need the start and end time, right? So the started at and completed at attributes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another data frame to capture that information. So it's going to be more or less the same thing, right? So more or less the same syntax here, just swapping out the objects we're extracting attributes from, and of course the key value pairs. Let's say flow execution history or flow run history. And then again, provide the key value pairs. So I'm going to say, let's just say flow ID, and then run.flowID for flow in, say run, let's just keep it same, and runs. What this is going to do is it's going to extract. So if I come back to here, for each of these run objects, flow run objects, it's going to extract the flow ID from each and place those in a list. I'm going to do the same thing for the durations, except what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to call this run duration. And what I'm going to do is call this run duration here. And what I'll do here is I'm going to say, instead of extracting each of the attributes, so the completed attribute and the started attribute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both of those and just compute their difference and capture those as one attribute in my, or one column within my data frame. So let's say run.completedAt minus run.startedAt for run and runs. So it's going to take the completedAt timestamp and the startedAt timestamp and compute the difference between those two to get a time delta value. So basically the days, hours, minutes, and seconds associated with this difference. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. And then let's look at flow run history. Okay, so for each run, we have the flow ID and the run duration. So here we have 6 seconds, 9 seconds, 13 seconds, 2 seconds, and so forth. So why are we grabbing the flow ID? We need the flow ID because we want to tie these runs, these particular runs, back to the flow info data frame. So for each run, or eventually what we're going to do is we're going to, here in a moment, I'm going to compute the statistics behind the history of each flow. We need to tie those values back to the flow info data frame using the flow ID. Let's do that now. So let's create a summary of the flow execution history. And to do that, I'm just going to say flow run summary equals PD. Actually, I don't need to create a data frame. I already have one. So I'm going to say flow run history. Then group that data by. So what I want to group it by, I want to group it by flow ID because I'm going to be computing these descriptive statistics for each flow based on the individual runs. And I want to compute that using the run duration attribute within this data frame here. Okay, so then let's do .ag. So which aggregations do I want to compute? I want to compute quite a few. So I want to compute the number of times the flow is run, the total duration across all those runs, the average duration, the max, and min. Okay, so I have my aggregations I want to compute for each flow. Next thing I want to do is I actually need one more thing, and that's going to be the duration range, right? So what is the difference between the maximum and minimum runtime duration for each of the flows based on all, well, across all runs? So to do that, there's a few ways to do this. You could actually do what I'm about to do sitting in here. I've chose not to do this, chose not to put it in here. So you could put a lambda in here, do the same as I'm about to do with .assign. I just think assign is a little bit more intuitive, a little bit more straightforward, and you don't have to deal with a awkward return column name if you put it up in here. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to say .assign, and I'm going to say duration range. So how do I want to define duration range? I want to say lambda. I want to say flow, and then flow max minus flow min. And what's this doing? It's creating a column called duration range. And for each flow, it's going to take the maximum duration and subtract that from the minimum duration that was previously computed here. Okay. Next thing I want to do, well, we can just look at this real quick, right? So let me run this, and then we'll look at it, and then we'll keep going. So let me make sure I have the brackets right. Run this, and then let's look at the summary before I continue transforming this data frame. All right. So for each flow, we have the number of times that flow was ran, 9, 2. We have the sum, the total duration across all runs. We have the average duration. We have the max, min, and duration range. So the maximum minus the minimum. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I actually want to reset this index because I actually want this to be these attributes to be represented as columns in here. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm just going to continue to chain. I'm going to say reset index. And then what I want to do here, I'm actually going to rename all of these columns besides the flow ID. So to do that, I'm going to use .rename, and then I'm going to provide a list of key value pairs. So the keys are going to represent the original column name. So in this example, count, sum, mean, max, min, duration range. And the values are going to represent the new column names. So let's do count, say run count, sum. The reason I'm doing this is just to provide plain English report friendly column names. Okay, so I provided a series of key value pairs representing the old column name and the new column names. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like by running this. Okay, and now we have our transform data frame that has plain English report friendly column names. The next thing I want to do is I want to actually convert these to seconds. I don't want the time delta format, right? I don't want 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes, 8 seconds. I want just the seconds. I want to convert all of these to seconds. So how can I do that? We're going to do it same operation for each of these columns. I'm just going to modify these in place. So I'm going to say convert each duration-based measure from time delta, there's no hyphen in that, time delta data type to raw seconds. So we'll do this by accessing each of the attributes. So I'm going to say flow run summary, total duration, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use Pennis's datetime method. So I'm going to say .dt, .total seconds. What this is going to do is it's going to take this total duration and convert this 1 minute and 12 seconds to seconds. So that should be 72 seconds. I'm going to do that for the other attributes as well. So I'm just going to do some copy and paste here. So let's do average duration. Maximum. Minimum. And this should actually be duration range. Okay. So as a result of doing this, each of these columns and their values contained in those columns should be converted to raw seconds. So let's go ahead and do that now and take a look. Okay, so as expected, 72 seconds, 29 seconds, all of these have been converted to seconds. The next thing we need to do, so we have our descriptive statistics for each flow, and we can tie those back to a particular flow, right, in our flow info where we previously captured the flow owner ID, the name, project ID, project name, and so forth. What I want to do now is I want to go back up here and gather the user information associated with the flow owner. So here in our flow info data frame, we capture the flow owner ID. This is going to be the user ID tied to a user object. To do that, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to access a particular endpoint, use list comprehension, and store those user objects in a list. So I'm going to say gather all users. Users equals user for user tsc.pager server.users. And why am I coming back up to the top here instead of putting it down here? The reason I'm doing that is because I'm using a context manager to sign into my server and access each of these endpoints. And there's no reason for me to do all of this here. So if I don't need to be connected to the server to do all this transformation, then I don't want to be. I want to ensure that my connection is persistent or lasts only as long as I need it to. So I'm going to put the gathering of user objects up here, and then I'm going to create a user data frame down here. And at that point, the connection will have been closed because the context manager will take care of that for me as soon as all of the code within this block has been executed. Okay, so I have my users here. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and then we can take a look at the users list, which is going to be a list of user objects. There are 2 users in this users list. Both of them are tied to me, different email addresses. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of them. We have quite a few attributes here. So we have the authentication setting, the domain name, external user ID, the ID, last login, etc. The ones that I'm going to actually extract for this report that I find meaningful are going to be the user ID. That's a given, right? So the user ID is going to be this ID here. And why do we need that? Just to reiterate, we need that because we need to tie that ID back to the owner ID attribute that we extracted for the flow. So this is going to be the user that owns the flow. Okay. I also want to get the display name, which I'm going to say is full name. So the full name, this attribute, if you go into the front end of your Tableau server or Tableau Cloud server, you're going to see this represented on your Tableau server within your personal settings as display name as opposed to full name. So I'm going to use the front end terminology. I'm also going to extract the email address and then the site role. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to say user info equals pd.dataframe. And then same thing as all of the other data frames, we're going to provide a list of key and value pairs, or a series of key and value pairs. And those keys are going to be the column names, and the values are going to be list comprehensions that extract the specific attributes from each of the user objects. So let's do user ID. And once again, I'm just going to copy and paste this once per attribute that we need. And to state again, how do I know what attribute to extract for display name, user ID, email address, and site role? I know that because of this information down here. We took a glimpse into the attributes that are maintained for each user object, so I'm just providing the actual attribute value here. Okay, so this is going to be email. This is going to be site role. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. As expected, we have 1 row per user, the corresponding attributes of user ID, display name, email address, and site role. All right, so we have all these data frames. They're all independent right now, sitting by themselves, right? But the point of this report is to bring all that information together. And to do that, we actually need to merge it. So we're going to create this flows report by merging each of these data frames. User info, flow run, summary, data frames. And to do this, again, we're going to use the merge method. So merge, if you're an SQL user, think join. If you're an Excel veteran, think VLOOKUP. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say flows report. So we're going to start with the flow info data frame, the initial data frame we created above that captures information corresponding to each flow. And I'm going to say .merge. How do I want to merge? Well, the right side is going to be the user info. So I want to merge this to user info. And then how do I want to merge this? Need a comma there. How? I want to say left and then left on. What is the key attribute on the left side? So when I say left side, I mean the initial data frame. So flow info, that's going to be the flow owner ID. Right on. Okay, and what is the corresponding attribute that we can tie each of those flow owner IDs to, right? What which attribute from the user info data frame corresponds to the flow owner ID attributes from the flow info data frame? Well, that's going to be the user ID. All right, so we will have merged the flow info and the user info data frames. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show this intermediate step very quickly. So let's just run this and then look at the flows report. So we have two flows, or two user IDs. And let's make sure we have this right. So we have two flows. And what we can do is just to recall how many flows we actually had, just to get a sense check. Just go do flow info. Two flows. Okay, that makes sense. And then let's go back to the flows report. All right, so we have one row per flow. We have the corresponding flow ID, owner ID, name, project name, and then the user info that we merged together that corresponds to the flow owner ID. If you notice, the flow owner ID and user ID values naturally match because that's what we merged on, right? So it's stating that I own, or this user ID owns, this particular flow, right? As a result of this merge, we have a redundant column, which is going to be user ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and drop that column. We don't need two columns stating the same piece of information. Just go ahead and drop that. So we say drop columns and then say user ID. Run that again. Take a look at it. We've dropped the user ID column. We're good to go. The next thing we need to do is, well, we've merged the flow info and the user info data frames. The next thing we need to do is we need to merge the flow run summary data frames with this intermediate data frame. That's the result of merging those two previous data frames. So we're going to say dot merge. Same thing, right, is equal to which data frame are we merging? We're going to say flow run summary. And then how, left, and then on equals flow ID. So why are we merging this on flow ID? We're doing that because the flow run summary data frame contains two attributes, the flow ID and the corresponding run duration, which is, well, it contains the flow ID and then quite a few attributes describing the flow run history for that flow. So it contains these attributes: the total duration, average duration, maximum duration, minimum duration, and duration range. Again, the reason we're merging on flow ID is because that's the shared attribute between the summary and the corresponding flow run info, or the flow info, right? So we're going to take the summary statistics for each of the flows and merge that here with the flow info data frame based on the flow ID matching. So let's take a look at that. Let's run this again. And now what you'll see is we have now bolted on the summary statistics for each flow. So for this particular flow, the Superstore flow, it's ran 2 times for a total of 29 seconds, average duration of 14.5, and so forth. We also, as saw previously, we have the user information associated with that flow. So now we have flow information, we have the user information associated with the flow owner, and we also have some statistics that describe the flow's execution history. So on average, how fast does it run? What is the maximum duration of all those runs across each flow? The minimum duration, the duration range. Okay, we have our report here. So our flows report is complete. We have 2 flows. Now, this isn't particularly useful, just sitting in this ID/editor. I need to be able to disseminate this information, right? So if you are running this report for your server and you have hundreds of flows, you're probably not going to sit here and take screenshots or jot down pieces of information that you find important and send that across via an email or some other reports. You're going to want to be able to disseminate this much more easily. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to write this to an Excel workbook. So let's do that now. So what I'm going to do is I am going to copy and paste some code that I use quite often, and then I'll explain it. There's not really much value in you watching me type this out. So I'm just going to copy and paste it and then talk about it. Okay, so here is that code. And what I'm doing here initially is I'm using pathlib to create a path object. That path object states that I want to write a flows report to this directory. So I want to write it in the tutorial 9 subfolder within the Tableau Server Client folder. The report name is going to be flows report _ followed by the date and time for which the report was generated, or this, in other words, this code block was written, or the script was executed, sorry. And why do I want to do that? Well, more often than not, you're going to be running one of these reports more than a single time, right? You're not going to just run it once and be done with it. You're going to want to run it today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next month. And you want to avoid overwriting the report. So if you do this, we're not only going to be able to avoid overwriting a previous report, but also distinguish one report from another, right? So I'm going to append the date and time in this format. So 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, hours, minutes, and seconds to the file name. And to do what I'm going to do is I'm going to use pandas to write this to an Excel workbook. So I have the path. I'm going to pass that path to Pandas's Excel writer, and then say flows report to Excel using the writer, create a workbook, in this case a sheet, that's named flows. If you don't provide a sheet name here, you're going to get your default and probably expected, if you've worked with Excel for a long time, sheet 1 name. Not entirely useful, so just put something meaningful in here. Index is equal to false, so what is this? This is going to ensure that you don't have a redundant row numbering system in your file. So if you see the index here, right? If I keep this as true, the default value of true, you're going to see this column in here as well. Now, I'm quite confident that you find as useful as I do the built-in row numbering system of Excel, so you don't need this additional row numbering system that is starting at 0 as opposed to 1, right? It's just redundant. So I just always avoid writing that to the output. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is let's go ahead and run this and then look at that report. I will pull it up in Excel. Let's do that now. And switch over to Excel. Okay, so here is our report. We have, as expected, the same outputs that we saw in our IDE. 1 row per flow, the flow info, the user info, and then some various statistics regarding the flow run history. So for example, this flow here ran twice, total duration of 29 seconds, average duration of 14.5 seconds, and so forth. Super useful information, especially if you're trying to capture performance on your server across all flows. You can very easily write that to this data source, do some sorting, maybe even put this in a Tableau published data source so that you can create some visuals on it to see, okay, what are my flows that are poorly performing? Which ones are performing really well? Maybe try to figure out why they're performing really well or why they're performing really poorly. Or take the things that make a flow performant and apply those practices to your non-performant flows. And that wraps up this video on generating a flows report. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.